Incorruptibility is fundamental to the success of the Singapore government. Yet public declaration of assets by ministers is not practiced here. In countries like the UK, ministers are required to disclose their financial interests publicly, including investment properties. Perhaps we can consider adopting such a practice in Singapore as well.
Lobbying happens in all systems. Yet what is important is how a system regulates lobbying to ensure that the proper political process is not circumvented. Specifically, what prevents Singapore from passing legislation on lobbying?
I think different countries have different rules for their people and organizations. And as all of us will agree, no one rule is a panacea to prevent corruption or lobbying. But what we need to do is to look at the system holistically. What we also need to do is to look at the outcome that we have achieved and ask ourselves what is the scale and magnitude of our problem. Putting in new and more rules does not necessarily solve the problems that we may not even have to start with. So whenever we put in new rules, we must also be careful if it causes any unintended consequences.
Incorruptibility is fundamental to the success of the Singapore government. Yet public declaration of assets by ministers is not practiced here, although ministers do disclose this information as well as company directorships through the President via the Prime Minister in confidence as per the Code of Conduct for Ministers. As described in the Code of Conduct, this would help counter potential allegations of corruption and unexplained wealth and to avoid potential conflicts between private interests and public responsibilities. Public declarations would thus go a long way in ensuring public accountability, the Singaporeans to whom the executive serves, and not just accountability to the President. In countries like the UK, ministers are required to disclose their financial interests publicly, including investment properties. Perhaps we can consider adopting such a practice in Singapore as well. Such declarations will go some way to bridge the trust gap between Singaporeans and their elected officials and also help to prevent the spread of misinformation. For a start, we need not make the full disclosure of sensitive details mandatory. For example, in the case of residential properties, unit numbers can be redacted to protect the privacy of the minister involved. And I'm sure that this practice will be appreciated by Singaporeans. The question of whether our ministers can be trusted to scrupulously avoid any actual or apparent conflict of interest between their official duties and private financial interests, as the Minister's Code of Conduct requires them to do so, has been raised before in this House. During a parliamentary session on the rental of 26 Ridout Road last year, PAP MP Ms. Polisan suggested that it would be in the interest of transparency for Minister Shanmugam and Minister Vivian Balakrishnan to declare all their property assets. However, this was not a requirement under the Code of Conduct at the time. It should be.
Sir, trust between elected officials and public servants on one side and the public on the other is important for a well-functioning political system. It is important to maintain and enhance this relationship. Yet ties between state and society do not exist in a vacuum. As Singapore becomes an ever more important commercial and financial hub, more money and interest will flow into Singapore. They will have interest to advance and protect. Doing so may involve lobbying. It may involve the appointment of sitting members of parliament to boards or the hiring of former MPs and senior public servants to advise on the shaping of policy and legislation. We often see events by industry associations and others attended by elected officials. Lobbying happens in all systems. Yet what is important is how a system regulates lobbying to ensure that the proper political process is not circumvented and there is no undue disadvantage given to different groups in society, especially those with less money, access and voice. To this end, how can we improve oversight on lobbying activities given Singapore's changing circumstances? Specifically, what prevents Singapore from passing legislation on lobbying? Such a law could include publicly available registers of lobbyists, lobbying contact with political appointees, MPs, and very senior public servants, as well as board memberships of MPs. Some of this information is already provided by political parties under legislation governing political donations and the recently enacted FICA. Some will say that such a move is not foolproof. Nothing is. The perfect cannot be an enemy of the good. Properly regulating lobbying activity and addressing potential conflicts of interest reduces chances of excessive influence by certain groups and a shortening of political processes. It is an improvement on the current absence of formal regulation. Some may find allowing such public scrutiny onerous, but building public trust in increasingly complex situations also comes with those in positions of authority trusting the public, not just calling on the public to trust authority. This not only must be done, but must be seen to be done.
Ms. Ting Ru asked whether our regulations or practices need any updates and to ensure that our governance frameworks are not compromised, and Mr. Chua asked about making assets declarations public for ministers. I think I have responded to these topics previously extensively in past parliamentary replies. But if I may, I'll just reiterate a few things. I think different countries have different rules for their people and organizations. And as all of us will agree, no one rule is a panacea to prevent corruption or lobbying. But what we need to do is to look at the system holistically. What we also need to do is to look at the outcome that we have achieved and ask ourselves what is the scale and magnitude of our problem. Putting in new and more rules does not necessarily solve the problems that we may not even have to start with. So whenever we put in new rules, we must also be careful if it causes any unintended consequences. So for example, I just checked the data that was quoted by some members about some of the countries who have perhaps adopted some of those rules. In the Corruption Perceptions Index, Singapore in the last 5 years have been ranked consistently between number 3 and number 5. But those countries who supposedly have some of these more elaborate rules are actually ranked much lower. For example, the UK was ranked somewhere between 11 and 20. So I think when we look at how to make sure that we retain the trust of our people, we must look at it at a system level. And if I may reiterate what I have said previously, and this must occur at 3 levels. First, we must make sure that we select good people with the right values to understand not just the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law and uphold them. Number 2, we must work as a system, as a team, to make sure that we look out for one another, check one another blind spots, help to prevent one another from falling into a situation where they might be compromised. And third, we must have layers of checks internally and externally to pick up issues whenever there are problems. That is how we have managed to keep our system relatively corruption-free, lobby-free all these years. But we will be the first to admit that no system is perfect and the situation is evolving. And every time we put in rules, there will be parties out there that will try to go around our rules. And we have to keep constantly evolving our own rules to make sure that we are never complacent. But in trying to copy other people's rules, we must see what have they been able to achieve versus what we have been able to achieve, what problems they have been able to solve versus what problems we are trying to solve. And there's no magic answer to this. And we should also have a care for the confidentiality of the information, the privacy concerns of the senior officers in the public service, including the political office holders. Why stop at the ministers? Why not the members of parliament? Why stop at the PERMSECs? Why not the directors? I think for every rule that we put in, there are implications that we should consider carefully and ask ourselves whether the price that we pay is commensurate with the problem that we are trying to solve.